It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Gina Elliott is a semi-retired speech-language pathologist who holds a doctor in theology in Christian counseling. She has a significant experience in workshops on racial trauma and healing. Hasn't that been the consistent thread that no matter what angle people keep coming from, we come back to this need for healing? She has a specific interest in inner healing and the relationship between emotional development and spiritual maturity. Let's welcome Gina Elliott.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am just so honored and happy to be with you this morning to share on the topic of racial trauma and healing. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am, as was mentioned, a semi-retired speech-language pathologist, and I decided not to return to full-time work the summer of 2020, at the very beginning of the pandemic. Following the George Floyd murder, I had been working for 30 years, and for 25 of that 30 years, I worked in a city in Southern California that was historically a sundown city. And I started doing research on the topic of racial trauma during my time working there because I wanted to understand my experiences, because I had not really experienced some of the things that I experienced before, despite moving to a predominantly white community in 1965 in Southern California. There were some new things that God was exposing me to. So I have a doctor of theology in Christian counseling, and what that means is that my interest and my bent is really towards the integration of theology, psychology, and spiritual formation, as I believe that that is the best pathway to wholeness and healing. And when I'm talking about psychology, I'm talking about those aspects of psychology that are not in contradiction to theology. So I have about 30 minutes today, and we can go to the next slide. I forgot about that part. And so what I'm going to do is just share a very small bit of information from the workshops that I've been doing for the last 2 years through the Fellowship Center for Racial Reconciliation. I co-lead the workshop with John Williams, the director of the center, and we have an entire team of amazing and dedicated individuals who help us do the workshop. We're going to be doing the full workshop in January 2023 as part of Table Talks Conversations on Race in America. And the Fellowship Center for Racial Reconciliation is a ministry that is associated with Fellowship Church in Monrovia. And so if you are interested in doing the complete 8 weeks, I invite you to, in December or January, go to the website madeforfellowship.com. You'll have an opportunity to view a number of tables, including the one on racialized trauma. So in our workshop for that, we spend about 2 hours over a period of 8 weeks. And we have opportunities for small group discussions, whole group discussions. We have lots of homework. And we take about 4 weeks to unpack racial trauma. And then we take another 4 weeks to unpack pathways of healing and building resilience. And so part of what we're doing during that process is really explaining how racialized trauma has impacted everyone, not just people of color, but also white people. And Sarah, my co-leader and friend, is also a part of that process in helping us explain how we are all basically responding and bouncing off of each other's trauma. The next slide, please. So for our time today, what I'm hoping to do is just give language to some of the experiences that many people in this room have experienced. And then yesterday, as I was listening to presenters here in this venue and in the workshop, I was hearing people explain their experiences with racial trauma. So what I'm going to do today is just define racialized trauma. I'm going to talk a little bit about race-based traumatic stress. And then I'm going to talk about some very specific forms of racial trauma. And then this afternoon, I'm going to invite you to participate in the workshop that I'll be doing with Sarah on microaggressions, as microaggressions are also a form of racial trauma. So before I start, I am going to begin with a grounding exercise because the topic of trauma is a difficult topic, and I know that it might be challenging for many people. So what I would like for you to do is just settle in your seat, close your eyes, take some deep breaths at your own pace. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Acknowledge that you might have some difficult things come up and that emotions are attached to these things. Realize that you're not alone and know that Jesus is present with you. If thoughts or emotions come up for you, meet yourself with compassion. Take a few more breaths. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And gently open your eyes and come back to the discussion. Next slide. So let me start off by defining racialized trauma. Racialized trauma is defined as both the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color experience after experiencing stressful racist incidences. It refers to both mental and emotional injury that is caused by encounters of racial bias, racial discrimination, racial hate crimes and harassment, stereotyping, and profiling. It is often the result of a cumulative effect, and that negatively impacts people of color. These incidences happen repeatedly, and they cause the trauma to accumulate, and that contributes to chronic stress. Racialized trauma can come directly from a specific person or individual or from a wider system. Next slide. Now, racial trauma is a form of race-based traumatic stress. And any person of color is at risk of suffering from what is called a race-based traumatic stress injury. All people of color are vulnerable simply because we live in a racialized system that elevates whiteness and oppresses people of color. So people of color can experience race-based traumatic stress in their work setting, in their educational setting, in their church setting, even in their social spaces as they're navigating socially with people, as well as in the public setting. So when some people, prolonged incidences of racism can lead to symptoms that resemble post-traumatic stress disorder. And just keep in mind that post-traumatic stress disorder is something that can only be diagnosed by a clinical psychologist or a licensed therapist. But when I'm talking about race-based traumatic stress, it's not a diagnosable mental health disorder. It is an injury, and I frame it as a soul wound. And it can occur simply as the result of living in the world that we live in. So what we have here on the slides are some of the symptoms of race-based traumatic stress. Depression, I heard people mention that yesterday. Anger, rage, ruminating over the events of a particular incident, headaches, chest pains, sleep disturbance, feelings of low self-esteem, and mental or emotional distancing, as well as hypervigilance. Or that elevated state of constantly having your system on alert or alarm. Next slide. So historical racial trauma looks at how trauma is shared by an entire group of people. And this is compared to trauma that is shared or occurs with just an individual person. So historical racial trauma looks at how trauma is passed down generationally within a group or within a community. So we know that when we just look at America, there are entire communities that have endured historical racial trauma because of slavery, because of the Japanese internment, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and First Nation genocide, because of discriminatory laws and practices, as well as immigrants who are traumatized because of the immigration process. So the research on historical trauma, a lot of it comes out of the Jewish community and what was found as a result of the Holocaust. So with historical racial trauma, the trauma becomes collective, it becomes compounded, and it ends up affecting a significant portion of a community or a group of people. Next slide. Now contrast that to transgenerational trauma. Transgenerational trauma is sometimes called intergenerational trauma or multi-generational trauma. And this term responds to trauma that is passed down generationally within a specific family line. And I want to make you aware of a documentary as well as a book entitled Open Wounds. It was written by Phil Allen Jr. You can rent the documentary, I believe, on Vimeo, and you can buy the book Open Wounds on Amazon.com. But it is a depiction of transgenerational racial trauma that tells the story of a specific incident of racism that occurred to the author's grandfather, how that incident was handled by the community, how the incident was handled by the family system, and how the trauma was passed down to the author's father, and then how that trauma was passed down to the author. and it impacted the relationship between him and his father. So the documentary was done, first of all, just to educate people on transgenerational trauma. But it was also done as a pathway to healing because it allowed the author to tell his story. And so one of the pathways of healing is storytelling. Because in many generations, the typical response or reaction to racism and trauma has been silent. And we know that silence is not a pathway to healing. We believe that sharing your story is one of the pathways to healing. And I was very pleased to hear people having the freedom to share their stories yesterday, parts of their stories. Another documentary that would be well worth your time is one called Far East, Deep South. And it discusses the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act on a Chinese family as they trace their roots, believe it or not, to the South, to Mississippi. And you can get more information on fareastdeepsouth.com if you go to the website fareastdeepsouth.com. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how the transmission of information from one generation affects the subsequent generations and the offspring. So research shows that trauma events influence a person's brain and body at the cellular level in the DNA, and that traumatic events can leave a neurological mark or an imprint that can be carried into future generations. So these traumatic events are embodied or they're held personally, and then they're passed down, and then the next generation can carry trauma-related symptoms, even though they were never present at the initial traumatizing event. So individuals who do not directly experience a traumatizing event may feel the effects of those events generation later. The human body holds on to the stress, and then that leads to biological changes that predispose the offspring to certain diseases and symptoms. So while there are multiple factors that contribute to the health disparities with people of color, there is evidence that connects historical and generational racial trauma to some of the health disparities, including cancer, hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, as well as other conditions. And so this is the time when I like to encourage people of color to take their health very seriously. Maintain your diet, maintain your nutrition, and maintain your exercise, because there is that predisposition there. Next slide. Another form of racial trauma is vicarious racial trauma. And this occurs as the result of simply hearing the details of a racially traumatizing event or watching racially traumatizing events. So when someone is just simply watching an event on TV, they're hearing the details of that event on social media, etc., they may experience trauma vicariously. So following the George Floyd incidents, there was a lot of people of color, particularly in the African American community, who were experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and race-based traumatic stress. And it was very interesting because even mental health professionals didn't really understand why people were being so impacted. There seemed to be this expectation that communities of color were just supposed to get up, go to work, go about their business without being impacted. I was even listening to a Black clinical psychologist a couple of weeks ago who, the day after the George Floyd murder, she was approached by her organization to do a training and a workshop on work-related stress because they were concerned about the people in her organization feeling under stress. And so she said no, which is one of the pathways to healing, just by setting boundaries. She said, I would not be able to do that, I'm sorry. Also, due to the increase in anti-Asian hate crime during the pandemic, there was an increase of reports in sleep disturbance and anxiety and depression within the Asian community. So for some people, it can actually feel as if they're experiencing the racist event themselves. And then for some people, the trauma that was held within them becomes reawakened. And the impact of these incidences make people of color feel some kind of way. They may feel threatened. They may feel fearful, scared, hurt. There's shame that's also associated. They may feel depressed because they know that these incidences could happen to them, or they could happen to people who are close to them, like family members or friends. So it's really important that when you are navigating a space with a person of color and a recent event has happened, to keep in mind the impact of vicarious racial trauma. Next slide. And then finally, the last form of racial trauma that I'm going to share with you is racial gaslighting. Now, this occurs when people of color experience racism, and instead of having their experiences validated or affirmed, individuals or institutions try to manipulate or question the person of color's reality. The purpose of racial gaslighting is to maintain control, power, and superiority. Racial gaslighting forces people of color to question what actually happened to them. I hear some. And it causes people of color to second guess themselves. People of color begin to question their memory and their ability to recall the events. They begin to question their ability to interpret the event. And it makes people of color feel like they are the crazy ones. It shifts the scrutiny and the focus from the perpetrator to the victim. And it causes people of color to focus on their response as opposed to the racism itself. It often implies that the victim must have done something wrong. They're being too sensitive, or they're playing the race card. Just the denial of the existence of systemic racism is a form of racial gaslighting. It is a coded way of telling people of color that their experiences and these events occur in isolation and are unrelated to a larger system. We see examples of racial gaslighting in social media. When people post or they tweet information that they accept as fact. And I watched that a lot in 2020. Because of the fact that I grew up in a predominantly white community, I have a lot of white friends that I grew up with on Facebook. And so I would read their posts. And what I really began to understand is that most of the information that they were sharing was largely because they had very limited experience with people of color. These were people, and I don't want to be too specific, but they were growing up in Orange County, living in Laguna, having homes, $19 million homes in the top of the hills. And so they never have had opportunity to engage in meaningful and deep conversations with people of color in order to broaden their perspectives and to have a whole and complete understanding. So I want to give you some examples of racial gaslighting. Maybe you have heard these. Maybe some of you have even shared them. If people would just protest peacefully, more people would listen. What I said, what I did was not racist. Well, racism doesn't exist anymore. We have the Civil Rights Act. It was just a joke. You just don't understand my sense of humor. Well, you know, blank people are racist too. And you could put in any people of color group. Asian people, Latin people, Black people are racist too. And Sarah is going to set us straight on that this afternoon. Are you sure that is what happened? Well, just to play devil's advocate, in my opinion, I don't think they were being racist. I think, you have to be careful about saying those things. So I want to mention that racial gaslighting is really like doubling the trauma because the person has already experienced a traumatizing event, and when they go to share it or process it with someone, especially if they have a little bit of trust with that person, their inability to be heard is a second layer of trauma. I like to say it's like knowing that 1 + 1 = 2, but someone is trying to convince you that no, it equals 11. Gaslighting responses are injurious to people. They break trust and relational confidence and connection. And so when I think of a healing response, there's so much that I could say about that, but what I wanted to do was just make it very simple. The healing response is to validate, validate, validate. Seek to understand the person's perspective by asking questions and simply listening, not commenting or giving opinion. The posture is humility, exercising empathy, and laying aside pride. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a time to pause. I'm going to do a centering exercise. I'd like for you to close your eyes one more time. And we're going to take another moment to breathe. We're going to thank the Holy Spirit for being present with us. And I just want you to check in with your body, because we know that trauma is held in the body. See how your body is responding. Is your heart racing? Is your body tense? Are you breathing quickly? Are you holding your breath? Now, as you inhale, I want you to think in your mind these words: God knows. And as you exhale, think, God knows what I need. And just take some time to inhale, God knows, and exhale, what I need. Inhale, God knows, and exhale, what I need. And I want you to take about 45 seconds of just being present and silent before the Lord. If you become distracted, just think, God knows what I need. So now open your eyes and come back to the discussion. Sometime today, I would just like for you to take an opportunity to just reflect and write down how you're feeling. If it's hard for you to come up with specific words to label your feeling, just Google feelings chart. And you will find a label that might describe how you're feeling exactly. Take some time to reflect on forms of racial trauma that you may have observed or experienced, or maybe even perpetrated. And then think about how you have responded. And the last thing, or the second to last thing that I'm going to share with you, is just a blessing. And the blessing is called the hardest blessing. And it is a reminder that trauma is not our final home, and that healing and forgiveness are possible through Jesus. If we cannot lay aside the wound, then let us say it will not always bind us. Let us say that damage will not eternally determine our path. Let us say the line of our life will not always travel along the places we are torn. Let us say that healing can take some practice, can take some patience, can take a long and struggling time. Let us say that to offer the hardest blessing, we will need the deepest grace. That to forgive the sharpest pain, we will need the fiercest love. That to release the ancient ache, we will need new strength for every day. Let us say that wounds will not be our final home, that through it runs a road, a way we would not have chosen, but in which we will finally see forgiveness. So long practiced, coming toward us, shining with the joy so well deserved. And then finally, the very last slide is I just want to invite you to continue this work this afternoon and consider attending the workshop on microaggressions. My friend and co-laborer, Sarah Dornbos, will be doing the teaching on microaggressions, but we're also going to be doing some very practical exercises where we're going to actually analyze church microaggressions and learn how to respond as an advocate who is bringing grace and truth, and how to initiate conversations around the topic of race. So I hope that we will see some of you there this afternoon. Thank you so much.